Ilhan Omar just made the biggest mistake of her political career. She called a former Secret Service agent a racist cop on live television during a congressional hearing. Big mistake. Dan Bongino's response: "Congresswoman, shall we discuss your marriages? All three of them. What happened next will end her career forever." Smash that like button because you're about to witness the most devastating political takedown in history. This former NYPD officer and Secret Service agent who protected presidents is about to expose everything with documented evidence that will shock you to your core. Ilhan Omar thought she was untouchable. She thought her identity would protect her from scrutiny. She thought calling her critics racist would make the evidence disappear. She was wrong. When you attack someone who spent 12 years investigating fraud at the highest levels of government, you better be ready for war. This is bigger than any political scandal you've seen. This is the day America discovered that one of the most protected politicians in Congress has been running a fraud operation for over a decade. It was a Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C. The air in the Rayburn House office building carried that particular tension that precedes historic moments, though nobody yet understood just how historic this day would become. Capitol Police officers stood at their usual posts. Staffers hurried through marble corridors clutching folders and coffee cups. Tourists lined up outside committee rooms hoping for seats at what they assumed would be another routine congressional hearing. They had no idea they were about to witness the complete destruction of a political career, captured live on camera, documented in real time, impossible to deny or spin away. The House Judiciary Committee had convened for what the official schedule listed as a hearing on border security and immigration enforcement. The witness list included several former law enforcement officials, policy experts, and Border Patrol agents. Nothing suggested this would be anything other than another partisan sparring match, Republicans criticizing the Biden administration's border policies, Democrats defending them, everyone talking past each other while cable news played clips on mute in airport lounges across America. Standard Washington theater. But sitting calmly in the witness chair, reviewing his notes one final time, was Dan Bongino. And Dan Bongino had not come to discuss border security in any conventional sense. He'd come prepared for something far more significant, armed with folders thick with documents, official records, court filings, financial statements, and evidence that had been compiled over months of meticulous investigation. Evidence that would detonate like a bomb in the middle of American politics. Bongino looked exactly like what he was. Former NYPD street cop, hardened by years walking beats in rough neighborhoods. Former Secret Service agent, trained in the art of investigation, document analysis, and threat assessment. Now a media personality with millions of followers, but retaining that unmistakable law enforcement bearing, that calm confidence that comes from spending years dealing with criminals, liars, and people who think they're smarter than everyone else. He'd seen it all. Drug dealers who thought their street code made them untouchable. White-collar fraudsters who thought their lawyers and political connections would protect them. Corrupt officials who believed their positions placed them above scrutiny. He knew how criminals operated. He knew how they justified their crimes to themselves. He knew the patterns of deception, the defensive tactics, the way guilty people attacked their accusers instead of addressing evidence. And he knew that the most dangerous criminals were often the ones who wrapped themselves in righteousness, who claimed victimhood even as they victimized others, who used identity and politics as shields against accountability. Ilhan Omar had no idea what was about to hit her. The committee room filled steadily. Cameras from CSPAN, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and a dozen other networks positioned themselves for optimal angles. Print journalists took seats in the press gallery, notebooks open, pens ready, expecting to file routine stories about partisan bickering over immigration policy. Republican committee members filed in, most looking tired, resigned to another day of futile debate in a hopelessly polarized Congress. Democratic members arrived with that particular smugness that came from knowing the mainstream media would back them regardless of what happened in the hearing. And then Ilhan Omar entered. She walked in with the confidence of someone who'd survived countless attacks, who'd been called every name imaginable, who'd weathered scandal after scandal and emerged not just unscathed but more powerful. The media loved her. Progressive activists worshipped her. Democratic leadership protected her. She was untouchable, and she knew it. Her hijab was perfectly arranged, her expression serious but determined, projecting the image of a courageous woman standing up to bigotry and hatred. She'd perfected this performance over years in politics. Omar took her seat, positioned perfectly for the cameras. She glanced at Bongino briefly, and observers would later note the hint of a smirk on her face. She'd destroyed conservative critics before. She'd called them racists, Islamophobes, bigots. She'd weaponized her identity as a black Muslim refugee woman to deflect any criticism as hatred. And it had always worked. The media always took her side. Her allies always circled the wagons. Her critics always backed down or were dismissed as extremists. She had no reason to think today would be any different. Chairman Jim Jordan called the hearing to order at precisely 10:03 a.m. His Ohio accent carried clearly through the chamber as he delivered standard opening remarks about the importance of border security, the crisis at the southern border, the need for strong immigration enforcement. Democrats on the committee looked bored, already preparing their rebuttals about humanitarian concerns and Republican fear-mongering. Jordan introduced the witness panel, giving brief biographies of each. When he reached Dan Bongino, he spent extra time detailing the credentials. Our next witness served with distinction in the New York Police Department before joining the United States Secret Service, where he spent 12 years protecting Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. He investigated financial fraud, identity theft, and criminal enterprises at the federal level. He currently hosts one of the most popular political podcasts in America. Mr. Dan Bongino, the floor is yours. Bongino adjusted his microphone, took a sip of water, and began speaking in that distinctive New York accent that had become his trademark. His voice was measured, professional, carrying the authority of someone who'd testified in court proceedings many times before. Mr. Chairman, ranking member, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My remarks will draw upon my 12 years of federal law enforcement experience, including extensive investigations into fraud operations that exploit our immigration system, financial crimes that target government programs, and identity theft schemes that undermine the integrity of our institutions. He'd spoken for perhaps 90 seconds, laying out his background and establishing his expertise when it happened. Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Ilhan Omar's voice cut through the chamber like a knife, sharp and aggressive. She didn't wait for Jordan to acknowledge her. She simply kept talking, her tone dripping with contempt. I question whether this witness should even be allowed to testify. Mr. Bongino is nothing more than a right-wing conspiracy theorist with a well-documented history of promoting Islamophobic rhetoric and racist attacks against myself and other members of Congress. The room fell silent. Every camera swiveled toward Omar. This was the confrontation producers had been hoping for, though they didn't yet know just how explosive it would become. Omar continued, her voice rising with manufactured indignation. This man sitting here pretending to be an expert witness is actually just another racist ex-cop who's built an entire media career on xenophobia and hatred. He spreads lies about immigrants. He promotes conspiracy theories about Muslims. He attacks refugees like myself with vicious smears. And now we're giving him a platform in this committee room to spew more hatred. She pointed directly at Bongino, her finger jabbing the air for emphasis. This witness has no credibility. He has no legitimate expertise to offer. He's a propagandist and a bigot. And frankly, Mr. Chairman, his presence here is an insult to every immigrant, every Muslim, every person of color who serves in this body. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Omar had just called a former Secret Service agent a racist to his face, on live television, broadcast to millions of viewers. It was the nuclear option, the ultimate attack in identity politics warfare. Label your opponent as a bigot, make the conversation about their alleged hatred rather than any facts or evidence. Force them to spend all their time defending themselves against accusations of racism instead of making their actual argument. It was a tactic Omar had used successfully dozens of times. Critics would recoil, horrified at being called racist. Media would run headlines about controversial figures and inflammatory rhetoric. The target would end up apologizing, backtracking, explaining that they weren't really racist, while Omar claimed victory and moved on to the next battle. It had always worked before, but Dan Bongino wasn't like Omar's previous targets. The cameras zoomed tight on his face, expecting anger, outrage, perhaps a heated response that could be clipped and played on loop as evidence of his supposed extremism. But what they captured instead was something far more interesting and far more dangerous to Ilhan Omar. A slight smile, not a smirk of arrogance, not a sneer of contempt, but the calm, satisfied smile of someone whose opponent has just made a catastrophic tactical error. The smile of a poker player who's just been dealt a royal flush. The smile of a prosecutor whose defendant has just admitted to the crime on the witness stand. The smile of a man who'd been hoping, even expecting, that his opponent would attack him personally, because that would give him the opening he needed to destroy her completely. Dan Bongino sat perfectly still for exactly 3 seconds. The silence in that enormous chamber was absolute. Republican committee members watched with interest, sensing something significant was about to happen. Democratic members looked slightly nervous, perhaps recognizing that Omar's aggressive attack might have been unwise. Journalists leaned forward, hands poised over keyboards. The C-SPAN cameras recorded everything with unflinching clarity. When Bongino finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried throughout the chamber with absolute authority. Every syllable was precisely articulated, every word chosen with care. Congresswoman Omar, let me respond to your accusations directly, since you've chosen to make this personal rather than substantive. He reached down beside his chair and withdrew a thick folder, easily 3 inches deep, bulging with documents. It landed on the witness table with a thump that echoed in the silent room like a judge's gavel. That sound, captured perfectly by dozens of microphones, would be replayed millions of times in the coming days. It was the sound of evidence meeting accusations, truth meeting narrative, accountability meeting privilege. You called me a racist, Bongino said, his voice still quiet, almost conversational. You called me a conspiracy theorist. You called me an Islamophobe and a bigot. Those are very serious accusations, Congresswoman. So before we proceed, let me establish some facts about my background, and then we can discuss your record in detail. He pulled out an official document, holding it up so the cameras could see clearly. This is my United States Secret Service credential. For 12 years, I protected President Barack Obama, our nation's first black president, with my life. I stood post outside the Oval Office. I traveled with him domestically and internationally. I conducted advance work for his security details. I investigated threats against him. Bongino's voice hardened slightly. Does that sound like a racist to you, Congresswoman? A racist who spent 12 years willing to take a bullet for a black president? The question was devastating in its simplicity. Omar's expression flickered, the first sign that perhaps her attack wasn't going as planned. But since you've decided to question my credibility on national television, Bongino continued, since you've decided to smear me personally rather than address any substantive policy questions, I think it's only fair that we examine your record, Congresswoman. After all, if we're discussing credibility and character, yours is certainly relevant to this committee's work. The folder opened wider, revealing hundreds of pages of documents, all meticulously organized with colored tabs marking different sections. So let me ask you some questions, Congresswoman Omar. And I should note that everything I'm about to discuss is documented with official records, court filings, government findings, and public evidence. Bongino's eyes locked onto Omar's. Shall we discuss your marriages, all 3 of them? Omar's face went pale. For a split second, absolute panic flashed across her features before she recovered her composure. Or should we start with the campaign finance violations? Bongino continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a prosecutor laying out a case. The $250,000 fine you received from the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board for using campaign funds for personal expenses. The nearly $3 million you've paid to your husband's consulting firm. The allegations that you filed joint tax returns with one man while legally married to another. Each question landed like a precision strike. Should we discuss the allegations of immigration fraud that you've never addressed with actual evidence? The questions about whether Ahmed Nur-Said Elmi is your biological brother and whether you married him to facilitate his student loans and immigration status. Should we examine your anti-Semitic statements on the record? Your minimization of 9/11 as some people did something. Your statement that you identify as Somali first, Muslim second, not American. Your votes consistently supporting America's enemies and opposing our allies. Should we look at the $100 million welfare fraud operation in your district that somehow involves multiple members of your campaign staff and family? The ballot harvesting schemes documented on video during your elections. The pattern of systematic fraud that surrounds your political career. The chamber had erupted into chaos. Republican members were sitting up straight, fully engaged now. Democratic members looked shell-shocked. Journalists were typing frantically. The cable news networks had all cut to live coverage, recognizing that something historic was unfolding. Chairman Jordan banged his gavel. The chair will have order. The chair will have order. The noise died down. Jordan turned to Bongino. The chair recognizes that Congresswoman Omar made serious accusations against the witness. The chair will grant Mr. Bongino additional time to respond fully to those charges. Mr. Bongino, please proceed. Bongino's smile widened slightly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the additional time because I think the American people deserve to hear some documented facts about Congresswoman Omar's record. He extracted the first set of documents from his folder, official marriage certificates, with raised seals visible even on camera. Congresswoman Omar, according to public records from Minnesota, you entered into a religious marriage with Ahmed Hiasi in 2002. This marriage was not legally registered with the state, but it was recognized within your community. You had 2 children with Mr. Hiasi during this time. Bongino's tone was methodical, like a detective laying out a timeline for a jury. Then in 2009, while still in your religious marriage with Ahmed Hiasi, while still living with him, while still having children with him, you legally married a man named Ahmed Nur-Said Elmi. This legal marriage was registered with the state of Minnesota. He looked up from the documents. But here's where it gets interesting, Congresswoman. While you were legally married to Ahmed Nur-Said Elmi from 2009 to 2017, you continued living with Ahmed Hiasi. You continued having children with Ahmed Hiasi. And here's the critical part, you filed joint tax returns with Ahmed Hiasi. The room was silent again. That's tax fraud, Congresswoman. Filing joint tax returns with someone you're not legally married to while you are legally married to a different person is a federal crime. It's a violation of Title 26 of the U.S. Code. It carries penalties of up to 5 years in federal prison. Bongino let that sink in before continuing. But the bigger question is this. Who is Ahmed Nur-Said Elmi, and why did you marry him? He pulled out more documents, spreading them across the table. Multiple investigative journalists have presented evidence suggesting that Ahmed Nur-Said Elmi is your biological brother. The evidence includes statements from members of the Somali community in Minneapolis who knew your family. It includes school records from Kenya showing both you and Elmi at the same school at the same time. It includes social media posts that you subsequently deleted showing family relationships. It includes immigration patterns suggesting coordination. It includes the fact that immediately after marrying you, Elmi was able to obtain student loans and eventually U.S. citizenship. Omar sat frozen, her hands gripped together on the table in front of her, her eyes wide. Now, you've dismissed these allegations as conspiracy theories, Bongino continued. You've called anyone who asks about this issue a bigot or an Islamophobe, but you've never actually provided evidence to refute the allegations. You've never submitted to DNA testing. You've never produced family documentation. You've never explained the timeline. You've never clarified why you filed joint tax returns with one man while legally married to another. His voice hardened with intensity. In my 12 years as a federal agent, I learned something fundamental about investigating fraud. Innocent people provide evidence. They welcome the opportunity to clear their name. They produce documentation. They explain circumstances. They prove their innocence. Guilty people do something different. They attack their accusers. They scream about bigotry and hatred. They try to make the investigation itself the issue rather than the underlying facts. They hide behind identity politics and claim victimhood. Bongino looked directly at Omar. Your response to these allegations, Congresswoman, follows the guilty person playbook exactly. He produced another document, this one with an official Minnesota state seal. But we don't have to rely solely on circumstantial evidence about the marriage fraud. We have confirmed, documented proof of your financial crimes. On June 4, 2020, the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board issued findings against you. Let me read directly from their official report. Bongino held up the document so cameras could see it clearly. The board finds that Representative Omar improperly used campaign funds to pay for personal travel to meet with Ahmed Nursaid Elmi in London. The board finds that Representative Omar used campaign funds to pay for personal legal expenses unrelated to campaign activities. The board finds that Representative Omar improperly reported expenditures to obscure their personal nature. The fine, $250,000, $1 of the largest penalties in Minnesota campaign finance history. Bongino set the document down. This wasn't some conservative accusation, Congresswoman. This was an official finding by your own state's campaign finance authority after a formal investigation. They found that you stole campaign money for personal use. They documented it. They fined you. So let me summarize what we know with documented evidence, Bongino said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You entered a legal marriage with someone you allegedly knew to be your brother for the purpose of immigration fraud. While legally married to him, you lived with another man, had children with that man, and filed fraudulent joint tax returns with that man. You used campaign funds for personal expenses, including travel to meet the man you'd married for immigration fraud purposes. You were investigated and fined $250,000 by state authorities for these violations. He sat back slightly. Now, Congresswoman, you're welcome to respond to these facts with evidence. Release your tax returns for the years in question. Agree to DNA testing to prove Ahmed Nursaid Elmi is not your brother. Explain the timeline of your marriages and your living arrangements. Provide bank records showing your campaign payments were legitimate. If you're innocent, prove it. The silence that followed was damning. Omar opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. These are false allegations that have been thoroughly debunked, she finally managed to say, her voice shaky. Debunked by whom? Bongino shot back immediately. Name one actual investigation that debunked them. Name one media organization that examined the actual documents and conducted a thorough investigation. Name one. Omar had no answer. That's what I thought, Bongino said. You can't name one because no such investigation exists. The mainstream media took your word for it and called everyone who asked questions a bigot. But taking your word isn't an investigation, Congresswoman. It's journalistic malpractice. He pulled out yet another folder from his stack. But that's just the immigration fraud and the tax fraud, Congresswoman. We haven't even gotten to the really big money yet. Shall we discuss the nearly $3 million you've paid to your current husband's consulting firm? Shall we talk about how you've turned your campaign into a personal slush fund to enrich your family? The atmosphere in the House Judiciary Committee room had undergone a complete transformation. What began as a routine border security hearing had morphed into something unprecedented. A systematic criminal prosecution being presented live on national television, with the defendant sitting mere feet away from her accuser, unable to escape, unable to deflect, forced to sit and listen as years of protected corruption were exposed with documentary evidence. Dan Bongino reached for a new folder, this one bulging with Federal Election Commission reports, bank statements, and financial analysis documents. His demeanor remained professionally calm despite the explosive nature of the material he was presenting. giving his testimony the weight of a seasoned investigator rather than a partisan attack. Congresswoman Omar, let's move on to something more recent and frankly more easily documented, because it's all in public FEC filings that anyone can examine. Let's talk about your systematic theft of campaign funds through payments to your husband's consulting firm. He arranged several FEC documents with precision, creating a visual timeline. When American citizens donate money to political campaigns, they're contributing because they believe in a candidate or a cause. They're trying to influence elections and policy. They trust that their money will be used for campaign purposes, advertising, staff, voter outreach, legitimate consulting services. What they don't expect, Bongino continued, his voice hardening, is that their money will be funneled directly into the candidate's personal bank account through sham payments to family members. That's not campaigning, Congresswoman. That's embezzlement. It's theft. It's fraud. He displayed a timeline chart he'd created. In 2018, your campaign began paying a consulting firm called the E Street Group, which is owned by a man named Tim Minot. Initial payments were relatively modest by campaign standards, about $60,000 that first year, then $85,000 in early 2019. Minot's firm provided digital consulting services, website design, social media management, all very standard, all relatively reasonable amounts for those services. Bongino looked up, but then something changed dramatically. In mid-2019, the payments exploded. First quarter of 2019, $230,000. Second quarter, $420,000. Third quarter, $680,000. We're talking about a nearly tenfold increase in a matter of months. He pulled out another document. What changed? Well, your personal relationship with Tim Minot changed. In August 2019, Tim Minot's wife, Dr. Bate Jordan Minot, filed for divorce. And in her divorce filing, she made a very specific allegation. Let me read the exact quote from the court documents. Bongino held up the divorce filing. Quote, "Defendant's more recent travel and long work hours now appear to be more related to his affair with Rep. Ilhan Omar than to actual work commitments." End quote. This is sworn testimony in a court proceeding, Congresswoman. Your current husband's ex-wife stated under oath that by April 2019, you were having an affair with him. The timeline Bongino presented was devastating. So we have documentary evidence that your affair began by April 2019. And what do the FEC reports show? That payments to Minot's firm more than doubled immediately after your affair began. Coincidence? I don't think so. He continued building the case. By the end of 2019, your campaign had paid Minot's firm $1.9 million in a single year. In 2020, another $900,000. In March 2020, you filed for divorce from Ahmed Hiasi. Later that same year, you married Tim Minot. The progression couldn't be clearer. Affair begins, payments explode, you divorce your husband, marry the consultant, payments continue to flow. Bongino pulled out a comprehensive financial summary. From 2018 through early 2024, your campaign has paid Tim Minot's E Street Group approximately $2.8 million. That's not a typo. $2.8 million from a single-house campaign to one consulting firm owned by your husband. He let that number hang in the air. Now, you'll claim these were legitimate consulting fees for legitimate services. So let's examine that claim using basic industry standards and common sense. Bongino produced a comparative analysis chart. The average house campaign in a competitive district pays between $50,000 and $100,000 per election cycle for comprehensive digital consulting services. High-profile, competitive races might pay $150,000 to $200,000 for truly exceptional, cutting-edge digital strategies. You represent Minnesota's 5th Congressional District, Congresswoman, Minneapolis, one of the safest Democratic seats in the entire country. You won your last election with 74% of the vote. You face no serious Republican opposition. Your primary challenges have been minimal. You don't need extensive advertising. You don't need sophisticated voter targeting. You don't need competitive-level digital strategy. His voice dripped with sarcasm. Yet somehow, your campaign paid one firm $2.8 million for digital consulting. That's roughly 28 times the average House campaign. That's more than many competitive Senate campaigns pay for comprehensive media strategy. Bongino displayed screenshots and analytics. So for that $2.8 million, what did Tim Minot deliver? What incredible, revolutionary, groundbreaking digital strategy justified that astronomical amount? He clicked through examples. Your social media presence is unremarkable. You have a decent Twitter following, but the actual content strategy is basic, nothing sophisticated. Your website is a standard template design that probably cost $10,000 to create. Your digital advertising was minimal during your election cycles. Your voter outreach was standard for a safe seat. There's nothing here that justifies millions in consulting fees. So what were you actually paying for? Bongino asked. Let me show you where the money really went. He produced invoices and financial records. The invoices from E Street Group list vague services, digital consulting, strategic communications, travel coordination. They're deliberately vague because they're designed to disguise personal payments as business expenses. But journalists have tracked some of this spending, and we have witnesses who have observed your activities. Category 1, Personal Travel. Over $200,000 was billed as consulting travel, but actual investigations show these were luxury vacations. California wine country, Miami Beach, Martha's Vineyard. Weekend getaways that had nothing to do with your campaign. This is you using donor money for romantic trips with your boyfriend, then husband. Category 2, Personal Legal Expenses. Over $500,000 was billed as strategic communications, but was actually paid to your personal lawyers defending you against the immigration fraud allegations and handling your divorce from Ahmed Hiasi. Campaign money cannot legally be used for personal legal matters, Congresswoman. Category 3, Living Expenses. We have evidence suggesting payments were used for rent, groceries, car payments, furniture, clothing, all billed as campaign expenses and funneled through Minot's firm to obscure their personal nature. Bongino's voice turned ice cold. This is systematic theft, Congresswoman. You treated your campaign account as a personal bank account. You funneled money to your boyfriend's firm, and he kicked it back to you as cash and personal expenses. This is classic money laundering and embezzlement. He pulled out his most devastating evidence yet. And we know this is exactly what you did because you've already been caught and punished for it once. Bongino held up another official Minnesota document. On June 4, 2020, the Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board investigated your campaign and issued findings. Let me read their conclusions. The board finds that Representative Omar's campaign committee spent approximately $21,000 in 2016 and $1,500 in 2017 on travel to Boston, Massachusetts, and Berlin, Germany. Some of those trips were personal in nature. The board concludes that campaign funds may not be used for personal travel. The board finds that Representative Omar's campaign committee spent approximately $1,500 on legal consulting, which involved personal matters of Representative Omar. Campaign funds may not be used for personal legal matters. The board finds that Representative Omar's campaign committee accepted and reported numerous contributions that exceeded the $3,000 annual contribution limit or were from prohibited sources. The penalty, $250,000, as I mentioned earlier, one of the largest fines in Minnesota history. Bongino looked up from the document. And how did you respond to being caught, fined, and publicly sanctioned for stealing campaign money? You paid the fine with more campaign money, which itself might be another violation. You never admitted wrongdoing. You never apologized to donors. You never reformed your practices. In fact, you continued doing the exact same thing. Even after being caught and fined in 2020, you paid Minot's firm another $700,000 in 2021. $450,000 in 2022, $380,000 in 2023, and $320,000 so far in 2024. You just got slightly better at disguising it. Bongino gathered his papers. This is federal embezzlement, Congresswoman. This is wire fraud. This is money laundering. These are serious federal crimes that carry sentences of up to 20 years in prison. And the evidence is all in public FEC filings that anyone can examine. Chairman Jordan leaned forward. Congresswoman Omar, do you wish to respond to these specific allegations? Omar's voice, when she finally spoke, was defensive and shaky. These were legitimate business expenses that were reviewed and approved by the Federal Election Commission and by campaign finance attorneys. The FEC didn't review them, Bongino interrupted sharply. The FEC is notoriously understaffed and years behind on enforcement. They haven't reviewed your filings in any detailed way. What happened is that Minnesota state authorities investigated and found you guilty of violations. The FEC might get around to investigating eventually, but I'm not waiting for their slow, bureaucratic process. His voice rose with controlled anger. I'm calling for a federal criminal investigation right now. The evidence of systematic embezzlement and fraud is overwhelming. Any federal prosecutor worth their salary could get convictions on multiple counts based on what I've presented here today. Bongino looked directly at the cameras. And I want to speak directly to the people who donated to Ilhan Omar's campaigns. Your money didn't go to advancing progressive causes. It didn't go to helping refugees or fighting for health care or any of the things she promised. It went to fund her personal lifestyle and enrich her husband. You were defrauded. You have standing to file complaints with the FEC and potentially to sue for fraud. He turned back to Omar. But that's just the campaign finance fraud, Congresswoman. We're not done. Not even close. Let's discuss your anti-Semitism, your statements minimizing terrorism, your declarations of loyalty to foreign countries over America, and your consistent support for America's enemies. If the previous revelations about fraud had been devastating, what Dan Bongino was about to present next cut to something even darker and more dangerous. A documented pattern of anti-Jewish hatred, sympathy for terrorist organizations, and foreign policy positions that consistently undermined American national security interests. Bongino's demeanor shifted slightly. The calm, methodical presentation of financial crimes now gave way to something more personal, more morally urgent. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years protecting Americans from terrorism, who'd stood post against threats to national security, who took seriously the oaths he'd sworn. Congresswoman Omar, he began, I protected Jewish Americans as a Secret Service agent. I investigated terrorist threats against our nation. I stood on the front lines of counterterrorism efforts. So when I see a member of Congress trafficking in anti-Semitic tropes and expressing sympathy for terrorist organizations, it's not just offensive to me personally. It's dangerous to the country I spent 12 years protecting. He opened a new folder, this one organized chronologically. Let's document your pattern of anti-Semitic statements and actions, because there's a clear and undeniable record. February 10, 2019. You tweeted about pro-Israel political support in America. Your exact words. It's all about the Benjamins, baby. For those who don't understand, you were invoking one of the oldest and most pernicious anti-Semitic tropes in existence, that Jews buy political influence with money, that Jewish financial power controls American politics. Bongino displayed the tweet on screens throughout the chamber. When called out for this, you doubled down. You specifically named AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, suggesting they were buying congressional support. The backlash was immediate and bipartisan. Even House Democrats, your own party, passed a resolution condemning your remarks. March 2019. Speaking at a bookstore event, you said, and I quote, I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay to push for allegiance to a foreign country. This is the classic dual loyalty anti-Semitic trope, suggesting that American Jews are more loyal to Israel than to America, that they can't be trusted as Americans because of their Jewish identity. His voice hardened. This isn't criticism of Israeli government policy, Congresswoman. Plenty of people, including plenty of Jews, criticize Israeli government actions. That's legitimate political discourse. What you did was different. You questioned whether American Jews can be loyal Americans. That's anti-Semitism. Bongino pulled out more examples. April 2019. Speaking about the September 11th terrorist attacks that killed nearly 3,000 Americans, you said, and these were your exact words, CAIR was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something, and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. Some people did something. Bongino let those words hang in the air. 19 al-Qaeda jihadists hijacked 4 planes and deliberately flew them into buildings, murdering 2,977 innocent people. That's not some people did something, Congresswoman. That's mass murder. That's terrorism. That's an act of war against the United States. Your minimization of 9/11, your casual dismissal of the worst terrorist attack on American soil, was so offensive that even Nancy Pelosi, who usually protects you, had to distance herself from it. Bongino displayed a compilation of her statements. But these aren't isolated incidents. There's a pattern. In 2012, you tweeted that Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. The hypnotized world. That's literally the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jews control global opinion through some kind of mystical or media power. You've consistently compared Israel to Nazi Germany, another vicious anti-Semitic tactic. You've suggested that supporting Israel is equivalent to supporting fascism. You've accused pro-Israel Americans of dual loyalty. You've used anti-Jewish tropes about money and power again and again. His voice rose with controlled anger. Jewish members of Congress have said they feel unsafe around you. Jewish constituents have said your rhetoric has led to increased threats against them. Synagogues in your district have reported increased harassment, but you never apologize. You never take responsibility. You just claim that any criticism of you is Islamophobic. Bongino pulled out voting records. But it's not just rhetoric, Congresswoman. Your actual policy positions consistently undermine American national security and support America's enemies. Let's look at your voting record on foreign policy. You've consistently voted against sanctions on Iran, even as Iran funds terrorism, develops nuclear weapons, and chants death to America. You've voted against measures to counter Hezbollah, a terrorist organization. You've opposed support for Israel even when Israel is under direct attack from terrorists. You've sided with Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro regime against American interests. You've opposed sanctions on Turkey despite Erdogan's human rights abuses and authoritarian crackdown. You've voted against measures to counter Chinese aggression. The pattern is absolutely clear. On virtually every foreign policy vote, you support America's enemies and oppose our allies. Bongino produced a particularly damning document. But what's most revealing is a speech you gave to a Somali-American audience in 2023. You told them, and this is documented on video, "We are people who know that they are Somalians first, Muslims second." He looked up. You're an elected American congresswoman who took an oath to the United States Constitution. And you told an audience that you identify as Somali first, Muslim second, not American. You didn't even mention being American. You publicly declared that your loyalty is to Somalia, a foreign country. In any other era, Bongino said, his voice carrying moral authority, that statement alone would have ended your career. Imagine if a member of Congress with Irish heritage said they were Irish first, Catholic second, and never mentioned being American. Imagine if a Jewish member said they were Israeli first. The media would destroy them. But you said it, and your media allies covered for you. He pulled out intelligence analysis. Let's discuss the national security implications of having you in Congress with access to classified information. You sit on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. You receive intelligence briefings about terrorist threats, about adversarial nation activities, about sensitive operations. But our intelligence allies, British MI6, Israeli Mossad, other Five Eyes partners, have expressed serious concerns about sharing sensitive information with members of Congress who have questionable loyalties and connections. They worry that information shared with Congress might end up in the wrong hands. Bongino's expression showed disgust. And can you blame them? You've declared loyalty to Somalia first. You minimize terrorism. You support regimes hostile to America. You maintain connections to organizations with documented terrorist ties. If I were still in the Secret Service conducting security assessments, you would be flagged as a potential counterintelligence concern. He produced another document. Let's talk about your relationship with CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations. In my counterterrorism training, I learned about CAIR's history. The organization was founded with connections to Hamas. In the Holy Land Foundation trial, the largest terrorism financing prosecution in U.S. history, CAIR was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. The FBI officially cut ties with CAIR in 2009 due to concerns about Hamas connections. Yet you maintain close relationships with CAIR. You were a community organizer with them. You speak at their events. You coordinate policy with them. You share staff and donors with them. Why, Congresswoman? Why do you maintain ties with an organization the FBI refuses to work with due to terrorism concerns? Bongino laid out more evidence. In 2013, you gave an interview where you discussed Al-Qaeda. Your exact words were, "I was in high school. A lot of my awareness of Al-Qaeda came from actually. I think it was BBC, and our school played a pivotal role in actually just exposing us to that. In a very kind of, it sounds like a spin, you just sort of have to laugh because it's such a they tell you Al-Qaeda, sounds kind of scary, but when you really think about when you think about Al-Qaeda, but when you say America, no one it's a weird it doesn't sound, equally, it sounds of course I'm yeah, so I think it's just really important to kind of, name it and understand it." That's a direct quote, Congresswoman. You suggested that saying Al-Qaeda gets people upset, but saying America doesn't, implying some kind of moral equivalence between a terrorist organization that murdered thousands of Americans and the United States itself. Bongino gathered his documents. What we have here is a comprehensive pattern: anti-Semitic statements on record, minimization of terrorism, public declarations of foreign allegiance, support for America's enemies, connections to organizations with terrorist ties, and access to classified intelligence despite all of these concerns. He looked directly at Omar. You represent a clear and present danger to American national security. You should not have access to classified information. You should not sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and you certainly shouldn't be in Congress at all. His voice cut like a knife. But what's most disturbing is how you've been protected. When anyone criticizes these documented positions, you scream Islamophobia. The media shields you. Democratic leadership defends you. Speaker Pelosi watered down resolutions condemning your anti-Semitism. The squad circles wagons around you. Legitimate criticism gets dismissed as bigotry. You've weaponized your identity, Congresswoman. Your race, your religion, your refugee status. You've used all of it as a shield to protect yourself from accountability that any white Christian member of Congress would face immediately for identical statements and actions. Bongino's expression was hard and unforgiving. But that protection ends today. The evidence is now on the congressional record. Your anti-Semitism is documented. Your foreign allegiances are stated in your own words. Your sympathy for terrorism is captured on video. The American people can see it all. And you can't hide behind identity politics anymore. The committee room had gone silent again. Several Democratic members looked deeply uncomfortable, finally forced to confront documentation that they'd previously been able to ignore or dismiss. Republicans sat transfixed, recognizing that Bongino had just systematically destroyed any remaining credibility Omar possessed. Chairman Jordan looked troubled but determined. "Mr. Bongino, are there additional areas you wish to address?" "Yes, Mr. Chairman," Bongino replied. "We need to discuss the systematic voter fraud in Congresswoman Omar's elections, the welfare fraud network operating in her district that involves her campaign staff and family members, and the evidence suggesting foreign money has infiltrated her campaigns. If we're going to examine her record comprehensively, we can't ignore the corruption of the democratic process itself." The hearing had now been running for nearly 4 hours, but nobody was leaving. This had become the most consequential congressional testimony in modern American history, and everyone in that room knew they were witnessing something that would reshape American politics for years to come. Dan Bongino pulled out yet another thick folder, this one containing investigative reports, video evidence, affidavits, and forensic analysis of election irregularities. His expression carried the intensity of someone presenting evidence of a crime against democracy itself. Congresswoman Omar, let's discuss how you actually got elected to Congress, because your rise to power wasn't through grassroots organizing and community support. It was through what appears to be systematic voter fraud and corruption of the electoral process. He displayed a map of Minnesota's 5th congressional district. In 2016, you ran in the Democratic primary against Phyllis Khan, a longtime incumbent who'd held the seat for 44 years. This was considered an impossible challenge. Khan had institutional support, name recognition, and a strong progressive record. Nobody gave you a chance. But you won, Bongino continued. You shocked the political establishment by defeating a powerful incumbent. How? The answer appears to be systematic fraud. He pulled out video evidence. In September 2020, Project Veritas released undercover footage from Minneapolis showing ballot harvesting operations on a massive scale. The videos showed individuals collecting hundreds of ballots, often from a single apartment building. They showed cash being exchanged for ballots. They showed your campaign workers coordinating these operations. Bongino played clips on the committee room screens. The footage showed a man sitting in a car with stacks of ballots, literally dozens of them, explaining how he collected them from voters. Another clip showed someone discussing payment for ballots. Another showed coordination with campaign operatives. Minnesota law allows someone to collect ballots for up to 3 people, but this footage shows individuals with 50, 60, 70 ballots. That's not helping a few elderly neighbors vote. That's an organized operation to harvest ballots on a massive scale, and the evidence suggests your campaign was directing it. He produced voter registration analysis. Forensic examination of voter rolls in your district revealed serious irregularities. Over 1,000 voter registrations listing the same address, physical impossibility, unless that address is a massive apartment complex. But many of these were single-family homes. Dead people still on the rolls, in some cases voting in your elections. Duplicate registrations. Same person registered multiple times at different addresses. Non-citizens registered to vote. In the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, your political base, voter turnout in your elections exceeded 95% in some precincts. That's statistically impossible without fraud, Congresswoman. The highest legitimate voter turnout in U.S. history was around 80% during the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876, which itself involved massive fraud. Modern elections with clean processes rarely see turnout above 75%, even in the most politically engaged communities. Bongino displayed sworn affidavits. Poll watchers who tried to observe your elections reported systematic intimidation and exclusion. They described being blocked from entering polling places, being harassed by your supporters, seeing ballots filled out in groups rather than privately, observing violations of election procedures. This isn't democracy, Congresswoman. This is machine politics. This is Tammany Hall-style corruption transported to Minneapolis in the 21st century. He pulled out another set of documents. But the voter fraud connects to something even bigger, the welfare fraud network operating in your district and involving your associates. Minnesota authorities have investigated massive welfare fraud in the Somali community. Over $100 million in fraudulent childcare claims. $50 million in healthcare fraud. The scheme worked like this. Fake childcare businesses would be set up, often just mailbox addresses. Parents would claim they were paying these businesses for childcare. The state would reimburse the payments, but no actual childcare was being provided. The money was being split between the fake business owners and the parents, with a significant portion being wired back to Somalia. Bongino's voice carried moral outrage. This is American taxpayer money being stolen through systematic fraud and sent overseas. But here's what's interesting. Multiple people connected to these fraud schemes are also connected to your political organization, Congresswoman. He provided names and connections. Members of your campaign staff have been convicted of welfare fraud. Major donors to your campaigns have been convicted of welfare fraud. People you've employed, people you've advocated for, people you visited in prison after their convictions, all involved in systematic theft from American taxpayers. Is this coincidence? Or is this the culture you've created where fraud is normalized, where stealing from government programs is just how things are done? Bongino laid out the comprehensive pattern. Immigration fraud, your marriages; tax fraud, your returns; campaign finance fraud, your spending; voter fraud, your elections; welfare fraud, your network. Do you see the pattern, Congresswoman? Every aspect of your political career is touched by fraud. His voice rose with intensity. You came to America as a refugee from Somalia. This country gave you everything: safety from the violence and chaos of your homeland, educational opportunities, economic opportunity, the chance to build a life, eventually even a seat in Congress, one of the highest honors and positions of trust in our entire system. And how did you repay that generosity? With systematic fraud at every level. You defrauded the immigration system. You defrauded the tax system. You defrauded campaign donors. You defrauded voters. You associated with people defrauding welfare programs. You've spent your entire American life taking, stealing, defrauding, betraying every trust placed in you. Bongino's voice carried absolute moral certainty. You're not a victim of discrimination, Congresswoman. You're not a target of Islamophobia or racism. You're a con artist who's gotten away with systematic fraud for over a decade because media allies and political allies protected you based on your identity. They were afraid to investigate you, afraid to criticize you, afraid of being called bigots. He stood, gathering all his documents, the physical weight of evidence stacked high. I'm calling for criminal investigations by the U.S. Department of Justice into immigration fraud, tax fraud, campaign finance fraud, election fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. These are serious federal crimes, and the evidence I've presented today is more than sufficient to warrant prosecution. I'm calling for the House Ethics Committee to immediately open comprehensive investigations into your conduct. I'm calling for you to be stripped of all committee assignments pending those investigations. I'm calling for your expulsion from Congress under Article I, Section 5 of the Constitution, which allows the House to expel members for misconduct. The chamber erupted. Republican members were nodding, several standing to applaud. Democratic members looked shell-shocked, unable to defend the indefensible, unable to dismiss the documentary evidence that had been presented. Journalists were typing frantically, recognizing they were covering a historic moment. Ilhan Omar's voice, when she finally found it, was barely audible. This is a coordinated racist attack designed to silence a black Muslim woman in Congress. No, Congresswoman, Bongino cut her off firmly, his voice carrying absolute authority. This is accountability. This is what happens when someone finally has the courage to present documented evidence of your crimes. This is what happens when identity politics meets facts. He locked eyes with her. You've avoided accountability your entire career by weaponizing your identity. Any criticism was dismissed as bigotry. Any investigation was called a witch hunt. Any critic was labeled a racist. And it worked for years because people were afraid. But I'm not afraid, Congresswoman. I have the evidence. I have the documents. I have the official findings. I have the video footage. I have the court records. I have everything, and I've now put it all on the congressional record where it can't be ignored or spun away. His voice softened slightly but lost none of its intensity. The American people deserve to know who you really are, not the carefully crafted image of the courageous refugee standing up to power, but the reality. A systematic fraudster who's betrayed every trust, violated every norm, and corrupted every system you've touched. Your career is over, Congresswoman. Your protection is gone. Justice, so long delayed by your identity politics shield, is finally coming for you. The room fell into stunned silence as Bongino collected his materials. Chairman Jordan, recognizing the historic nature of what had just transpired, spoke with unusual gravity. The chair thanks Mr. Bongino for his testimony. The chair will immediately issue criminal referrals to the Department of Justice regarding the matters raised today. The chair will refer all findings to the House Ethics Committee for immediate investigation. The chair will call for an emergency caucus meeting to discuss Congresswoman Omar's committee assignments and status in this body. As cameras captured Ilhan Omar leaving the hearing room, her face streaked with tears, her usual confident demeanor completely shattered, flanked by lawyers whispering urgently in her ears. It was clear to everyone watching that something fundamental had shifted in American politics. Dan Bongino had accomplished something remarkable, using nothing but documented evidence, systematic presentation, and the courage to speak truth without apology. He'd held accountable one of the most protected politicians in America. He'd proven that identity politics, no matter how aggressively deployed, couldn't withstand the weight of facts. He demonstrated that courage combined with evidence could break through any protective narrative. As Bongino walked out of the Rayburn building into the bright Washington sunshine, he was immediately surrounded by reporters. Questions came from all directions. "Mr. Bongino, do you think Congresswoman Omar will face criminal charges?" His response was measured. "That's not for me to decide. I presented evidence. Now law enforcement and prosecutors need to do their jobs. But I will say this. If any ordinary American had committed the acts I documented today, they'd already be in handcuffs. Let's see if she gets equal treatment under the law. Do you think she'll resign?" "She should, but I doubt she will. People who engage in systematic fraud for over a decade don't suddenly develop integrity. She'll fight, she'll claim victimhood, she'll attack everyone investigating her. That's what guilty people do." "Do you have evidence on other members of Congress?" Bongino smiled slightly. "Let's just say this is the beginning, not the end. There are others who have been protected by identity politics and media allies. Others who think they're untouchable. They're watching what happened today, and they should be very, very concerned." Within hours, the footage of the hearing had been viewed tens of millions of times across every social media platform. Within days, it would break 100 million views, becoming the most-watched congressional testimony in American history. The immediate aftermath created a political earthquake that would reshape American politics in ways that few could have predicted. Within the first 60 minutes after the hearing concluded, social media exploded with unprecedented intensity. Omar Exposed trended #1 worldwide with over 800 million impressions. #Bongino Destroys hit 600 million. #Drain the Swamp resurged with 400 million impressions. The footage was being shared, dissected, analyzed, and discussed across every platform, every political persuasion, every demographic. But what made this different from typical viral political moments was that the conversation wasn't contained in partisan echo chambers. Liberal commentators who'd spent years defending Omar and dismissing allegations against her as Islamophobic conspiracy theories now found themselves forced to grapple with documentary evidence they couldn't dismiss. The Democratic Party's response revealed a party in absolute crisis. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who'd protected Omar for years, issued a carefully worded statement that said everything by saying nothing. "The House takes all allegations of misconduct seriously and will allow proper investigative processes to proceed. We believe in due process for all members." Translation: Omar was on her own. The protection was over. The squad's response was more telling. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted within an hour, standing in solidarity with that Ilhan Omar against coordinated right-wing attacks. But notably, she didn't address any of the specific evidence. Rashida Tlaib called the hearing an Islamophobic witch hunt, but similarly avoided discussing the documents. Anna Presley remained entirely silent. Behind closed doors, according to leaked information, senior Democrats held emergency conference calls. The message from party leadership was clear. Don't defend the specifics. Don't engage with the evidence. Express general support for due process and change the subject to Republican extremism. But the evidence was too detailed, too well documented, too damning to be swept aside with procedural platitudes and deflections. By the 24-hour mark, institutional responses began cascading. The Department of Justice announced it was reviewing materials related to potential violations of federal law. The FBI's Counterintelligence Division confirmed it was examining concerns about foreign influence. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division opened a file on potential tax fraud. Minnesota state authorities announced they were reopening investigations that had been closed prematurely. The House Ethics Committee, despite its reputation for protecting members, announced an immediate bipartisan investigation. Even Democrats on the committee, recognizing the political impossibility of appearing to shield Omar after what had been revealed, voted for the probe. Chairman Jordan announced Omar would be immediately stripped of her committee assignments, a humiliating demotion that effectively ended her ability to influence legislation or policy. Within 72 hours, Omar's campaign infrastructure was collapsing. Major donors sent letters demanding refunds and threatening legal action. Progressive organizations that had championed her began quietly removing her from their websites. Congressional colleagues, even those who defended her, began avoiding her in Capitol hallways. The political calculation was simple and brutal. Association with Omar was now toxic. Primary challengers in Minnesota's 5th District began announcing campaigns within days. Don Samuels, who'd nearly defeated Omar in the 2022 primary, announced he was running again with what he promised would be the most well-funded primary challenge in Minnesota history. But perhaps most significantly, the hearing had broken through the media's protective bubble. For years, mainstream outlets had dismissed allegations against Omar as conspiracy theories peddled by Islamophobic right-wingers. They'd never seriously investigated the marriage questions, the immigration fraud allegations, the campaign finance violations, or the welfare fraud connections. Now, reporters who'd ignored the story for years were scrambling to catch up. The Washington Post assigned a team of investigative journalists to examine Bongino's documents. The New York Times ran articles with headlines like, "Questions Mount About Rep. Omar's Financial Practices." Even MSNBC began running segments examining troubling allegations that warrant investigation. David Steinberg, the independent journalist who'd spent years researching Omar's background and had been dismissed and deplatformed as an Islamophobe, suddenly found his phone ringing with interview requests from outlets that had previously refused to cover his findings. "I documented all of this years ago," he told Fox News. But nobody would listen because they were more interested in protecting a member of the squad than reporting the truth. Dan Bongino did in 5 hours what the media should have done 5 years ago. For Bongino himself, the 72 hours after the testimony transformed him from a prominent conservative commentator into a genuine political phenomenon. His podcast downloads increased by 400%. The Bongino Report website crashed repeatedly from traffic overload. Speaking invitations poured in from across the country, but Bongino remained focused on the broader mission. In an interview 72 hours after the hearing, he made clear this was just the beginning. "People keep asking if I'm satisfied, if I feel vindicated. I'm not here for personal vindication. I'm here because our political system has been corrupted by people who use identity as a shield against accountability." Ilhan Omar is just one example. There are dozens more in Congress, in state legislatures, in city councils. They've learned that if they scream racism or Islamophobia loud enough, the media will protect them and evidence will be ignored. He continued, "What I proved today is that the protection ends when someone has the courage to present evidence anyway. When you have documents, official findings, financial records, court filings, when you have actual facts, the defensive shield collapses. And that's what terrifies the establishment, because if one person can do it, others will follow." Indeed, conservative activists and journalists across the country were already mobilizing. Inspired by Bongino's systematic presentation, they began compiling similar evidence files on other politicians accused of corruption. The message was clear. The era of protection through identity politics was ending. 6 months after Dan Bongino destroyed Ilhan Omar in that congressional hearing room, the landscape of American politics had been fundamentally transformed in ways that few could have predicted. The federal courthouse in Minneapolis had become the center of what legal analysts were calling the most significant political corruption trial since ABS-CAM. Ilhan Omar, the woman who'd once been untouchable, who'd been protected by media allies and shielded by identity politics, now sat at the defendant's table facing a staggering 47-count indictment. The charges included immigration fraud, tax evasion, wire fraud, campaign finance violations, making false statements to federal authorities, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. The indictment, handed down by a federal grand jury just 8 weeks after Bongino's testimony, read like a RICO prosecution of a criminal enterprise. It detailed systematic fraud spanning over 15 years, involving multiple co-conspirators including Tim Minett, several family members, and various campaign staffers. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on the documentary evidence Bongino had presented to Congress: marriage certificates, tax returns, FEC filings, bank records, and official findings from Minnesota authorities. Usually in political corruption cases, you're dealing with contested interpretations of events, he said she said testimony, and questions about intent, explained former federal prosecutor Andrew McCarthy. But in the Omar case, the documents tell the story themselves. You have official marriage records showing she was married to one person while living with and filing joint taxes with another. You have FEC filings showing millions in payments to her husband's firm. You have official findings by Minnesota authorities of violations. The defense has very little room to maneuver. Omar's legal defense struggled from the beginning. Her attorneys initially tried to argue the charges were politically motivated, that their client was being prosecuted because of her race and religion. But federal prosecutors demolished that argument by pointing out that the investigation had been triggered by documentary evidence presented in a congressional hearing, that every charge was supported by official government records, and that dozens of white politicians had been prosecuted for identical conduct. The trial became a media spectacle. Courtroom seats were raffled due to overwhelming public interest. The prosecution methodically presented evidence over several weeks. Former Secret Service agents testified about fraud investigation techniques. Forensic accountants walked the jury through money trails. IRS agents explained tax fraud statutes. Immigration experts detailed legal requirements for marriage-based immigration benefits. But the most devastating testimony came from members of Minneapolis's Somali community, who'd previously been too afraid to speak publicly. Protected by witness security protocols and given anonymity where legally permissible, these witnesses provided first-hand accounts of Omar's political machine: ballot harvesting operations, welfare fraud networks, community intimidation tactics, and yes, the whispered knowledge that Ahmed Elmi was her brother and that the marriage had been a fraud from the beginning. One elderly Somali man, testifying through a translator and behind a screen, told the jury, "In our community, everyone knew. We knew Ahmed Elmi was her brother. We knew the marriage was fake, but we were afraid to speak because if you criticized her, you were called a traitor to Somalis, a tool of white supremacy. She used our community to build power, then used that power to steal and enrich herself." The jury deliberated for just 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on 43 of 47 counts. Omar's face remained impassive as the verdict was read, but observers noted tears streaming down her cheeks. Her sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, with legal analysts predicting she would face between 8 and 12 years in federal prison, given the scope and duration of her criminal conduct. But the Omar prosecution was just the most visible manifestation of the broader transformation Bongino's testimony had triggered. The Bongino effect, as political scientists began calling it, had fundamentally altered how corruption allegations were investigated and reported across American politics. In the 6 months following the hearing, similar investigations had been launched against a dozen other members of Congress from both parties. The evidence-based approach Bongino had demonstrated, systematically compiling public records, financial documents, and official findings rather than relying on anonymous sources or speculation, had been adopted by investigative journalists, conservative activists, and even some mainstream media outlets. Representative Cori Bush of Missouri found herself under investigation for similar campaign finance violations after activists compiled evidence showing she'd paid her husband's security firm over $500,000 in apparent violation of FEC regulations. Representative Rashida Tlaib faced renewed scrutiny about her residency during her initial campaign. Even some Republican members weren't immune. The new standard of accountability based on documentary evidence applied regardless of party affiliation. The media landscape had shifted dramatically. Networks that had dismissed Omar allegations for years found their credibility severely damaged. A Media Research Center study found that 73% of Americans believed mainstream media had deliberately protected Omar from scrutiny because of her identity. And trust in legacy, media outlets had plummeted to historic lows. Meanwhile, outlets like the Bongino report, which had led the charge investigating political corruption, saw their audiences surge. Dan Bongino himself had become something more than a media personality. He'd become a symbol of the broader movement demanding accountability from political elites. His book, Taking Down the Frauds: How Evidence Defeated Identity Politics, debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there for 22 consecutive weeks. Universities invited him to speak about investigative journalism and government accountability. Law enforcement organizations recognized him for demonstrating the importance of systematic evidence gathering.